Good day, grade 12 learners, and welcome to today's English Home Language Paper 2 lesson. My name is Belinda Retief, and I'm going to be helping you to prepare for tomorrow's big literature paper. We are doing home language, and should you be writing FAL tomorrow, you will also find my colleague Karabu presenting a lesson specifically aimed at your paper. This lesson is brought to you proudly by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with the Sabono Discovery Centre. Let's get right into having a look at what you can expect from paper 2 tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when you begin to write. So we are going to be focusing briefly, once again, just on the structure of the paper so that you know exactly what to expect, what the mark allocations are, and you can get an idea of how much time to spend on each question. I'd also like to chat briefly about some of the common errors and misconceptions that we find occur year after year in the literature paper, and I'm going to draw your attention to these things so that tomorrow you will not be making these mistakes. We're going to be looking specifically at poetic devices such as diction, imagery, and tone, which are three of the devices that come up very, very often in the literature paper. I'm going to have a look at the rubric for the poetry mini essay and just break that rubric down for you so that if you choose to write the poetry mini essay, you know exactly what's required and you can go in equipped to get the best possible result. And if we've got time, which I'm sure we will, we're going to also have a look at approaching the unseen poem, because as I'm sure you know, every paper 2 has got an unseen poem. It's always question 5, and that question is compulsory. So every single learner has to answer that poem, and there are quite a few ways of approaching the poem that will enable you to get a good mark there. If we have a look briefly at paper 2, you will remember that paper 2 is divided into the 3 sections. So section A is your poetry, and that's always for 30 marks. And then it's broken up into the first 4 questions are scene poems. And of those 4, you will always choose 2. So they're going to give you, the first question will always be the poetry mini essay, which I'm sure you saw in your preliminary examination. And then questions 2, 3, and 4 are contextual questions based on poems that you have studied this year. And you choose any 2. And then, as I said a moment ago, question 5 is your compulsory unseen poem. And that is also for 10 marks. So you've got 2 seen poems for 10 marks and an unseen poem for 10 marks, which brings you to that total of 30. And then the next question is always on section B, your novel, which in your case, grade 12s, is either Life of Pi or The Picture of Dorian Gray. And there you will get an essay question and a contextual question, of which you answer 1. And then in section C, it'll be a question on your drama, which is either Hamlet, Othello, or The Crucible. And again, you will answer 1 question. And if you've answered the essay in section B, you must answer the contextual in section C. If you answer the contextual in section B, then you must do the essay in section C, so that by the end of the paper, you've done 1 25-mark contextual and 1 25-mark essay. If you do 2 contextuals, the second contextual will not be marked. That is officially the approach that they take at the marking center. So you will then have wasted a huge opportunity because you will be awarded absolutely 0 marks. The same goes for if you choose 2 essays. Again, The marker will then be instructed to mark your first essay. The second essay will be completely disregarded. What you can remember, of course, is that all of these instructions that we're talking about now will also be in the paper tomorrow. They very, very clearly instruct you which questions must be answered and how to go about choosing your questions. And they even provide you with a checklist on the paper. It's always on paper 3 of your literature question script. They'll give you a checklist to help you keep track of what you need to answer. So if you get into the paper and you're feeling uncertain, just read, and everything that you need to know will be there. And then, of course, the total for this paper is 80 marks, and you get 2.5 hours. And that excludes your reading time. So usually in most of the exam centers by about 8:15, but definitely by 8:30, you'll be seated in your center quietly, and they start to hand out your answer paper, and they'll go around and give you your stickers to paste on. You'll be signing the register, and then they'll give you the paper. You'll go through the paper, and then at 10 to 9, you get your reading time. So you get those extra 10 minutes, which are a wonderful gift. That's an excellent time for you to start looking at which poems they have asked. And please, grade 12s, in that time, do us all a favor. Read all the poems again, even though the poem is now familiar to you and you would have studied it during the course of this year and the last few weeks. I'm sure you've been going over your poetry. But read every poem again. It's a good opportunity, once again, to focus your mind on the poem, and read all the questions. Because when you choose, you need to choose the 2 that you think you are best equipped to answer. And so very often what might happen is a slightly more difficult poem might have more accessible questions. But because you said to yourself, oh, that poem is difficult, you didn't take the time to read the questions, and you may then miss out on an opportunity to answer more accessible questions. Whereas a poem that possibly was popular, or you liked the poem very much, perhaps the questions are a little bit tricky or a little bit difficult to access. And then just because you've chosen based on your emotional reaction to the poem, you might then do yourself out of a few valuable marks because the questions become more tricky. And that Good day, grade 12 learners. We had a break in our transmission because of load shedding and the generator that didn't kick in time. So I'm sure you're all quite used to coping with those kind of challenges. Welcome back to today's English Home Language Literature lesson. My name is Belinda Retief, and I'm going to jump straight back into the lesson where we were starting to read the scene poem at question 1. So I'm doing for you an example of how you would approach the poetry mini essay should you choose to do question 1. And just before we had the break, I was saying you're always going to read the poem twice. So this poem is an African elegy, and I'm going to read it for you now. We are the miracles that God made to taste the bitter fruit of time. We are precious, and one day our suffering will turn into the wonders of the earth. There are things that burn me now, which turn golden when I am happy. Do you see the mystery of our pain? That we bear poverty and are able to sing and dream sweet things, and that we never curse the air when it is warm, or the fruit when it tastes good, or the lights that bounce gently on the waters. We bless things, even in our pain. We bless them in silence. That is why our music is so sweet. It makes the air remember. There are secret miracles at work that only time will bring forth. I, too, have heard the dead singing, and they tell me that this life is good. They tell me to live it gently, with fire, and always with hope. There is wonder here, and there is surprise in everything. The unseen moves. The ocean is full of songs. The sky is not an enemy. Destiny is our friend. So that is the poem, and I've read it there clearly for you once. Now I'm going to go through the poem again, and I'm going to break it up into the various elements of the kind of question that they could ask. So the question that they asked in this paper was that you had to explain how these various poetic devices were used to reflect the resilient spirit of the African people, because that's what the poem was about. And the first one they pointed to was diction. So remember, if we talk about diction, we're talking about the specific words that the poet has chosen. And I'm sure you'll remember in your language paper that you wrote earlier on in the exams, in the comprehension, you got a question about diction, the use of words. So you're very familiar with this concept. So if we're looking at specific words that help us reflect the resilient spirit of the African people, we might do this. We might talk about words like elegy. Okay, so an elegy is usually a poem or a song that is written at a funeral or for a funeral. All right. But if you read this poem, you'll see that it's got a lot of very positive and life-affirming ideas. So really this elegy is about life and the promise of life and hope and opportunity in Africa. So the poet does something very different with this word elegy, which should immediately tell us that there's something very special happening in this poem. So you might, in your essay and in your planning, you might mention that word, elegy. And then another word that possibly has a religious or a spiritual connotation is a word like miracles. And I haven't highlighted for you, but obviously also a word like God has got very, very strong religious and spiritual connotations. And remember, the question said, talk about the resilient spirit of the African people. So you can say a word like miracle. You know, a miracle is something very rare and something quite amazing that happens and unexpected, and it brings with it only positive connotations. So the people they themselves are these miracles because they overcome no matter what difficulty might be in their way, or no matter how difficult it might be to live in Africa, the poet says that we, the African people, we are still miracles and we are precious. So you can talk about how all of these words link back to this idea of a resilient spirit. And remember, as you're writing, you're going to go back to your question constantly in that whiplash fashion and remind yourself, whether or not you're still answering the questions. And even this idea of bearing poverty. Okay, so remember, to bear something means, and here we're talking also in a figurative sense. Remember earlier I said sometimes learners don't interpret poems in a figurative way. So they suffer with poverty, and yes, in a physical sense, they're able to bear it in that they live through the poverty and they find a way to eat nonetheless, and they find water, even if it's just a little bit of water, and they somehow survive. But I think the writer here is also talking about, the spiritual survival. So even though the conditions, the physical conditions might be poor, they are still able within their spirits to withstand this terrible pressure that comes from having to live in these conditions where poverty is constantly an everyday reality. And so again, it shows that the African people have got a resilient spirit. Their spirit helps them to survive. They can bounce back again and again and again from setbacks. And you would also maybe mention words like sing or dream sweet things. Again, words that indicate that the spirit is strong. So they sing. They might be hungry. They might be poor. They might be bent under these poor conditions, but their spirits can sing and their minds can still dream and have a vision for the future. And again, that relates to the resilient spirit. And you can also go on to mention other words like bless and pain, life is good, and ideas of fire and hope. So any of these words, you wouldn't in your answer mention all of these, because remember, you've only got, I think it is 40 minutes, approximately 40 minutes to answer the poetry section, the two scene poems. So you're going to spend about 20 minutes on your essay, and it's only going to be about a page long. But you will choose the words that you feel the strongest about, and the ones that you can connect again back to the topic and this idea of a strong spirit that cannot be broken. It survives no matter what. And remember that if you're going to talk about diction, you will always quote the word from the poem that you're talking about, so that your examiner and so that your marker know what it is that you're talking about. So if you wanted to talk about diction, you might say something like this: the local people's problems are a burden which they put up with without anger. They endure and tolerate their hardship without distress or annoyance. They are accepting of their suffering, and they are prepared to live with it. The words convey the extent and the restlessness or relentlessness of their suffering. Okay, so you're going to talk about those particular words that you've chosen. However, now remember, we're going back to this idea of the resilient spirit. They are strong because they are able to bear their burdens. They do not fret, complain, or worry. They get on with their lives despite their hardships. They are resilient. And so I've taken my examples of diction and I've used them to prove the statement at the beginning, which is that the people are resilient. Their spirits survive, even though it's difficult. It's not easy, but they do it. And then they also asked about imagery. In this poem, An African Elegy by Ben Okiri, the resilient spirit of the African people is explored. Discuss this statement with reference to diction, imagery, and tone. So again, remember that was our question. Now we're going to go on and we're going to look at imagery. So just as a reminder, imagery is any use of words or elements in the poem that appeal to the senses. So if there's anything in the poem that encourages you to see a picture or feel a certain sensation, hotness or coldness, or even that talks about certain smells or certain tastes, all of that imagery is working on the senses. So let's look if we can find some words or some phrases that create images, and not only that create images that remind us that the people are resilient, their spirit, what's inside them is resilient. So if we look at line 1, we can see ideas like we are the miracles that God made. So this image is a very pure, very spiritual, very uplifting kind of image, okay? We are able to sing and dream. So the idea of dreaming, of being able to see into the future and beyond this present troubled time, that imagery also shows that the people are resilient. They're not just going to give up and say, oh, well, everything's terrible. We're so poor. We're so hungry. We've got no hope. And they just give up. Never, never, never in this poem do the people give up like that, because they've got that spirit that just cannot be broken. And even this idea of never cursing and of blessing in our pain. So these contrasts, even though the people are in pain, they will rather bless the world around them than curse. And that shows a very strong spirit, because it really is, it's in your spirit itself and within the spiritual realm that blessings and curses become real and become tangible things. And he emphasizes this idea of we bless them in silence. So they never ever curse, no matter how hard it is, no matter how hot the day might get, no matter how scarce the water might be. There are never curses. It is always this idea of blessing. And that shows the resilient spirit. Other things that you can mention there are the fire and the hope, where the ancestors tell him to live his life gently with fire and with hope. So you see that image of fire. It's a very powerful, colorful image. It might even make you feel, fiery within your own spirit, and this light that cannot get put out. So you see how it's appealing to your 5 senses, how the fire symbolizes figuratively this idea of hope and wonder. And again, the resilient spirit. If you were going to put all of those things together in your own words, it might look a little something like this, but remember that, the examiner is not going to expect the exact words that are on the memorandum. They are trained to mark and to look for the quality of your ideas. And so when you write, that's why it's so important that you very clearly state what it is you want to say, and you use your formal language, and you check your sentence construction so that what you're saying is very clear. And always make sure when you've written an answer that you go back and read over it, so that you're sure you've got proper full stops and your sentence doesn't become too long and difficult to follow. Rather use a series of shorter sentences where your ideas are clearly expressed. Let's have a look at an example. The religious and spiritual imagery helps to show or illustrate the resilience of the people. It could also explain that they are able to survive even though life is very hard for them. They choose to believe in more than just the physical world around them. They believe that they are miracles created by God, and this enables them to rise above earthly suffering. They hold on to their dreams, which shows that they are tough or resilient. They do not curse, choosing instead to focus on the blessings around them. They actively participate in blessing the environment. This gratefulness enables them to survive and be resilient. And so you see this idea of being grateful also becomes extremely important in the poem. That image of a people who do not curse, even though it would be the easy thing to do, they still rather search for ways to bless their environment and the world around them. And that shows this incredible gratefulness. And I would say, even although it's not written here, an incredible humility in the people. And that also makes them able to survive. They would not be able to survive if they weren't grateful and humble, if you think of the difficulties that the people face. And then the third aspect of the question, so they said in terms of tone, in terms of diction, imagery, and tone, show how the poem emphasizes the resilient spirit. And so if we looked at tone, remember that's the attitude of the speaker, or how the speaker feels about the subject matter. With tone, you can break it up for yourself very simply in your mind by starting always with, is the tone sort of positive or negative? And once you establish that positive and negative, you can also ask yourself, is the tone happy or sad? And those are never going to be your answers. Those are too simple. But from that, you can then refine, okay, if it's sad, what sort of sadness is it? If it's happy, what sort of happiness is it? And then you slowly think to yourself how the tone or the feeling, the emotion of the writer is reflected through the words and the ideas in the poem. And it says here, it's about the speaker's emotional response to the subject matter. So let's have a look at some of the places where we could see the tone. And so to formulate an answer, you ask yourself how the speaker feels. And immediately, the very, very first line of the poem is so illuminating, because the very first thing that he does as the writer is he puts himself in exactly the same place as the people in the poem when he says, we are the miracles that God made. And so you see that the tone of the poet is that he feels and identifies exactly with what these people are going through. It's not as if he's sitting somewhere in a safe, warm, comfortable place where there's plenty of food, watching, how these poor people suffer. He is there with the people. He's one of these people, and he suffers with them every day. And he also believes that he is a miracle and that he is made by God. So his tone is very respectful of the people and very inclusive. And you see these ideas, like he says, we are miracles and we are precious, and I am happy. All of these ideas also show the resilience, somebody who can suffer in the way that these people have suffered, and somebody like the writer who can make themselves part of this experience and still talk about dreams and golden opportunities and happiness. This person has got a resilient spirit. These people have a resilient spirit. Other things that we could talk about is surprise, or even that destiny is our friend. So in the poem, we've talked about dreams, a fire for the future, and even destiny, which is something, that the poet obviously believes in, but nobody knows what their destiny is. But he refuses to believe that his destiny is anything but positive. So his tone is very positive. It affirms life. It affirms dreams, possibilities, a positive future, because he says destiny is our friend. So your friend is somebody, that cares about you. They're going to do the best for you. They're going to make sure that bad things don't happen to you. And he believes that destiny is like that. So he's not always going to be in this situation where things are difficult, or where he's hungry, or his family is hungry. He believes that his destiny is just going to be something positive and something wonderful. And so you see that his spirit cannot be beaten, and that is what a resilient spirit is. And so when you do your planning for your poetry mini essay, you will make a few notes on diction, and then you'll go to your poem and you'll underline the examples of diction that you want to use. And then you'll make a few notes on imagery, and you'll do the same thing, underline the images that you feel are important, that link back to the resilient spirit, and you'll do the same thing with tone. And so the paragraph that you write for tone might look a little bit like this. The speaker feels like he is one of the people in the poem. He identifies strongly with them. Even though life is so hard, he does not leave, he does not run away. He stays because of his resilient spirit. He can experience wonder and surprise even. He can turn a seemingly desperate situation into a friendly destiny. His tone is positive and life-affirming. And there are other words that you might use there. You don't have to use the ones that I've used, but you'll see if we think about, what I said earlier, ask yourself, is the tone more on the negative side or the positive side? If it's on the positive side, what positive ideas? Positive about the future, happy about life, affirming the possibilities of the future, etc., etc. So those are the kinds of things that you would mention. Okay, and then I just want to remind you of the rubric for the poetry mini essay. So remember that the mini essay is out of 10, and out of those 10 marks, 6 marks are going to be for content. In other words, what you've said about diction, what you've said about imagery, and what you've said about tone. And so if you think about it carefully, it's roughly, they don't mark it exactly like this, but in your planning, you can say to yourself roughly 2 marks for diction, 2 marks for imagery, and 2 marks for tone. And that makes the essay seem a lot more accessible all of a sudden. Now, it's not 10, random marks associated to some miraculous interpretation that you have of the poem. No, they've broken it down for you. They've given you 3 things that they want you to talk about. So you talk for 1 paragraph about each of those, and that should be enough for the 6 marks, especially if you've quoted from the poem and linked it back to the question every time, which is easy enough to do. And then the other 4 marks are allocated to your use of language. So have you got a proper introduction and a body and a conclusion? Have you used capital letters? Are your sentences well structured? Have you got full stops at the end of your sentences? All of those rather simple things that you've been doing for 12 years, ever since you walked into grade 1. These are the exact same things that you're going to do. You're going to show links between your paragraphs and how your idea from one paragraph gets developed in the next paragraph. And those 4 marks for language will also be allocated, and that is your 10 marks for the poetry mini essay. And that's why we often say that learners can do very well in the poetry mini essay. Don't make the mistake of thinking it's too difficult. It might very well be a question where you can do extremely well if you've broken down those 3 elements that they've asked you about, link it back to the poem, link it back to the question, and you should be able to get the marks. And then I'm going to go on to an example of an unseen poem. This is the unseen poem that was in this year's May-June paper. So usually, or probably always with the unseen poem, is you are going to get either a local South African writer or an African writer. So very often then, your subject matter is going to be something to do with Africa, South Africa, the people, the landscape, possibly, the socio-economic situation, maybe the struggle. Those are the kinds of ideas that are going to be coming through in the unseen poem. I would like you, please, grade 12s, to always read your unseen poem twice and read your questions. Any good question contains information. And once you've read your poem twice and you've read the questions, there should be information out of those questions that you can extract and put into your understanding of the poem. So very often learners will come out of the exam and they'll say, oh, I didn't understand that unseen poem. I didn't know what was going on. And then I'll always say to them, you know, did you read it? Did you read it twice? Oh, no, I didn't have time. That is a very self-defeating argument, grade 12. You don't have time not to read the poem properly. It's no good sitting there for 15 minutes answering a poem that you haven't read and thinking to yourself that somehow the answers will come to you out of nowhere. They will not come out of nowhere. They will come out of the poem and out of your interpretation and your interaction with the poem. That's where the answers are going to come from. So please don't tell me afterwards, I didn't have time to read the poem. You must read the poem, because otherwise you've got nothing to base your answers on, because the answers are not going to come out of nowhere. So this poem is called Living Space. There are just not enough straight lines. That is the problem. Nothing is flat or parallel. Beams balance crookedly on supports thrust off the vertical. Nails clutch at open seams. The whole structure leans dangerously towards the miraculous. Into this rough frame someone has squeezed a living space, and even dared to place these eggs in a wire basket. Fragile curves of white hung out over the dark edge of a slanted universe, gathering the light into themselves as if they were the bright, thin walls of faith. So there's your poem. I'm going to, let me see what I'm going to do now. Let's go forward. Okay, so there's your poem. We've read it up to line 22, and then we're going to have a look at the questions. So in lines 1 to 7, it says, there are just not enough straight lines. That is the problem. Nothing is flat or parallel. Beams balance crookedly on supports thrust off the vertical. And the question says, what impression of the building is created in these lines? Now, before you even try and answer, remember we said you'll actually go back and read your poem again. If you didn't know, you now know that he's definitely talking about some sort of building. And there's a certain impression of the building that is being created. And that's interesting, because very often we might take a building very much for granted. You know, when you walk into the venue where you are writing tomorrow, writing your exam, it could be a classroom or a school hall or a community hall. You don't really get a specific impression of the venue. Most of the venues are very similar. It's a largish room. There's a clock at the front, maybe some other clocks. All the desks are in straight rows. It's nothing really special. There's nothing about this venue that would be different from the school next door or even the school in another province. All of the venues tend to, in the end, be very, very similar. But this building has got a certain impression. There's something about this building that has caught the poet's attention. And so as you read the poem, you must also be asking yourself, you know, what is it about this building that made the poet want to actually say something and write something about the building? And what he feels is there are not enough straight lines. That is the problem. Nothing is flat or parallel, okay, which also makes it very different from the venue where you will be writing tomorrow, because there it's all straight lines and it's all parallel. All the desks are in straight lines. They're parallel to each other. And that somehow, you know, brings a feeling of structure and order. And yet, in this building, none of those things is happening. But it still is a building. It still hangs on to itself. Beams balance crookedly on supports thrust off the vertical. And so there, to answer the question, you know, what impression of the building is created, you can go straight back to these lines and you could say, you know, it seems like it's an unusual building because it doesn't follow the normal laws of construction where we do have a lot of straight lines, a lot of parallels. You know, you might have columns or walls that balance each other. And usually it's not crooked. We wouldn't want a building to be crooked. And yet somehow in this building, things are crooked. So those are the things you're going to mention in your answer. And then at question 5.2, they say, refer to lines 9 to 10. The whole structure leans dangerously towards the miraculous. And then the question is, what impression of the building is created in these lines? I hope you've seen that over here where we talk about this ellipsis. So they give you the quote, the whole structure, and then they give you those 3 dots, the ellipsis, and they give you the last 3 lines towards the miraculous. Those 3 dots mean that they want you to go back to the poem and they want you to read everything, including all the words that are left out and replaced by the ellipsis. So they're actually talking about this whole quote. The whole structure leans dangerously towards the miraculous. And they ask what impression of the building is created in these lines. Okay. And so again, if you had to think of a building that was leaning dangerously towards the miraculous, that gives you a certain impression of the building. I might be a little bit sort of taken aback, a little bit afraid of a building that's leaning dangerously. So my impression might be it hasn't been built well, there hasn't been proper planning, proper guidelines and checking of the building while it's being created, and yet it's still standing, which is the miraculous part. So for those 2 marks, you'd have to talk about both. The fact that, there's still a miracle at play here, somehow, that the building doesn't fall down. So there is still something special about this building. Then in question 5.3, they say, refer to line 8. Nails clutch at open seams. Comment on the effectiveness of the image in the above line. Okay, and remember, we talked about imagery and we said that very often learners can't make this critical link between, the imagery and the effect of the imagery. And this is exactly what the question says, the effectiveness of the image, of the nails clutching at the open seam. So first, you're going to explain the image. You're going to say, that the nails that are usually used to hammer together or to join together certain structures in a very neat and final way, these nails are not really doing their job, and instead of joining, they are clutching. And so this idea of clutching is much more precarious. It doesn't, if I'm clutching onto something, it's like I could lose at any moment. It could be taken away from me. So, the effectiveness is that it emphasizes this idea that the building is very wobbly and skew and possibly dangerous and unpredictable and not safe, because the seam of the building, anywhere where 2 parts of the building are going to join, any 2 walls or the wall and the floor, those seams should be neat and straight if you look at any building around you, but these are not, they open. And so, the effect is to create this effect of not feeling safe, of the building being unusual, and the building being, put together by some force, but definitely not by the normal rules of building and construction, if you will. And then they say at question 5.4, despite the uncertainty of life in these circumstances, the poem offers hope for the future. And do you agree with this statement? Justify your response. And so remember, if you read this poem the first time, and perhaps you weren't exactly sure what it was about and what the message was, the question gave you that information. The question says that in these circumstances, life is uncertain, but the poem still offers hope for the future. So even if you didn't see that originally, they've given you that information. So if you've read your question carefully, you will know that that's what they want you to go and find. So let's have a look at the information that we gathered about this poem just by reading the questions and reading the poem. We gathered that the speaker is looking at a type of a building. And so again, you know, this is not the poem that you're getting tomorrow, unfortunately. Tomorrow you're going to get a different unseen poem, but you're going to follow the same method. And I'm showing you that if you follow this method, you're going to find out all sorts of things about the poem that you didn't know. And all of that information will be helpful and useful in answering the questions. And that's going to be your main goal. There is something miraculous about the structure and the building. It's important that nails try to grab at open spaces. Life is uncertain for people in the poem, but there are signs of hope and a future. So that is all information you didn't have before you read the questions. And so that brings me to the end of this presentation, grade 12s. I really hope that you've enjoyed it with me. I'd like to wish you all the best for your literature paper tomorrow. Remember to read the whole paper, exercise your choices carefully. At the end of the paper, go back, make sure you've answered everything that is required, you've answered every question, you've left nothing out, you've read through your literature essay and your contextual questions. You make changes and adaptations as you go along. And what I would suggest you do now for the rest of the afternoon and for this evening is that you spend time reading over your summaries for your play. So either Othello, Hamlet, or The Crucible. Read over those summaries. Make sure you know who your characters are and exactly how the events follow on from each other and how all of that is linked to the themes and the characters, because those are the kinds of things they always ask about, theme and character. And the same for your novel. Either read over your summaries, or a very effective way of revising your novel, if you've got an hour or two, which you do have, it's only 3 o'clock now, is to read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of every single chapter. So yes, it does take time, but it will give you excellent insight and an excellent revision into who the characters are, how the events follow on from each other, and, you know, what are the important things that take place and in which order do they happen. It's an excellent way now of revising, because you probably don't have time to read the whole book again. I certainly hope that you have read it more than once, but even if you haven't, it's not too late. You go and you read the first chapter and the last chapter and the last paragraph of each chapter, and that will give you a great deal of insight that you might not have now. And you take all of that with you tomorrow and you do your very, very best. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the paper is about, which poems they've chosen for us, but it doesn't matter which poems they've chosen because you are prepared. You know the poetic devices and you are able to apply those to any poem and to any question. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll be back again a little bit later, probably on the 1st of December or maybe the 30th of November, when we will be looking at paper 3. Until then, grade 12s, I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.